Anyone fancy some free money this Christmas? That appears to be what's on offer from Paul Craine MLC as he asks Tynwald to support his motion, which calls for the Isle of Man to benefit from the revenue generated on the seabed out to the median line between the Isle of Man and the UK. Scotland was granted similar benefits just prior to the independence referendum, so surely the Isle of Man has a strong case. Where does the petition originate?
The petition has come from Keith Crush and Philip Craine. Philip is actually a cousin of mine, but that's not why I'm picking up this petition. Having said that they're the petitioners, the petition originated with Nigel Crowe, who sadly passed away at the start of August. He'd been in hospice for a number of weeks. And Nigel is very well known for his work in heritage and culture and family history, farm boundaries, Manx place names, etc. But in his last few weeks, the topic that was engaging him in hospice was the research he was doing on access to the maritime holdings in the Irish Sea that are nearer to the Isle of Man than anywhere else. And this is the petition that he wanted to see go to Tynwald Court, not to Tynwald Hill, go to Tynwald Court. And he contacted me to see would I work through with that. So I'm delighted to do that. I think it's a really interesting area that we do need to explore further.
And for those who don't know, we have a territorial sea out to 12 miles. This was granted to us about in the 1990s sometime.
1991.
Yeah, 91. Yeah. And effectively we have pretty much full control of that territorial sea. What your petition looks to do is to increase that area.
It's actually not an increase of the territorial sea, because that would involve taking full rights and control over the area around the Isle of Man. The territorial sea extends out 12 nautical miles, 14 miles thereabouts, 22 kilometres, around the Isle of Man. We don't get the full amount of it to the north because Scotland also has a territorial sea and they meet, so it's slightly curtailed to the north. But what we're looking at here would be getting certain types of access to certain types of activities in the area of the Irish Sea that is nearer to the Isle of Man than anywhere else. So it wouldn't be the equivalent of territorial sea rights. And this is crucial in a sense to what's happening here. If we were to extend the territorial sea, and if there was a wind farm inside the area that we'd extended into, or if there was a wind farm being planned inside the area we'd extended into, we would take on the rights to make contracts with them, which would presumably end their existing contracts. And you could imagine a lot of opposition from many quarters to that. The work that Nigel did, and I would say, as we've sat and looked at it and tried to be true to what he was doing, because the other petitioners got engaged in this out of respect for Nigel and a willingness to take forward what he was working on. But the genius of it is that it is the gentlest possible approach you could make in this direction. So if what's being asked here is for the Isle of Man to have a fair, just and reasonable access to the benefits of these holdings. We wouldn't take over the area that's actually the rights lie with the monarchy, with the Crown estate.
And I suppose the Isle of Man is a Crown possession. That's why we're called a Crown dependency. The territorial waters surrounding the Isle of Man and territorial waters surrounding the UK are part of the Crown estate. So if it's the Crown, that surely the Crown's not going to mind which of its governments actually has some of the financial benefit.
Yes, it's a very interesting point. What we're looking at here would not change the rights of the Crown to have control over this area beyond our territorial sea but nearest to it. It would not change the ownership of anything currently there or planned. It would not change our relationship with the United Kingdom. As I say, it would not be an extension of our territorial sea. It would simply mean that when the Crown Estates require fees from wind farm development, is the easiest one to talk about. Those fees go to the Crown Estate. They give that to the government, and the government pays the Crown what used to be called the civil list, but is now strictly called the sovereign grant. And that's been happening since 1760.
The government you're referring to is the UK government in this instance.
Yes, except that Nigel was acutely aware that back in 2013, when Scotland was looking to hold a referendum and separate out, work began on extending those rights to the Crown Estate Scotland. And so almost half the exclusive economic zone of the United Kingdom is now handed over to Scotland. That goes up to 200 miles. This was established by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea back in 1982. And so Scotland gets the benefits of a very considerable area. They, in return, have to pay a percentage to the Crown as the sovereign grant. The amount they're paying at the moment is this year's is actually 12% of the benefits that they get. And those benefits are very substantial. So we would be looking, Nigel was keen to see that the Isle of Man should follow the Scottish model. So we would have the Crown Estates would still lease out this seabed, enter into contracts, take the money from it. It would be paid to the Isle of Man government. Perhaps we would have a Crown Estate Isle of Man, and we would then have to pay maybe 12% to the Crown. So the Crown wouldn't lose anything from this, then that's, they're not losers in this. There's a sense in which the only group that would lose in this would be the government of, England or United Kingdom, as you put it.
And how do you imagine the Isle of Man government would or what sort of reception would the Isle of Man government get, do you imagine, in a generally cash-strapped UK treasury with similar financial difficulties to the Isle of Man, for the Isle of Man coming and saying, it's not fair, really we ought to be getting this, not you. Can you imagine that they're going to get a warm reception?
I fully recognise what you're saying, and this is where what Tynwald's being asked to do on Tuesday is accept as policy that the Isle of Man should have the benefits up to the midway point. I think there have been various attempts to do that in the past, not perhaps as gentle as this one, as I've said, the way it's being done, and they've come to nothing. I think the feeling of external relations, the meeting I had with a couple of their officers, they thought the chances were slim. So I understand what you're saying, but you can see the difficulty that if the question that you're asking isn't it fair and just and reasonable for the Isle of Man to have benefits of the assets that are being developed, the maritime holdings? Is it fair for the Isle of Man to have those if it's nearer to us than any other jurisdiction? And the fairness of that is overwhelming.
It's a very clear argument, but fairness doesn't always come into it in politics.
That's absolutely true.
But I suppose what the motion, what the petition calls for, is a share. It doesn't necessarily say all of the benefits.
Uh-huh. And that's where what's going before Tynwald on Tuesday is that Tynwald adopts this policy of saying we should have the maritime benefits up to the halfway point, and that Council of Ministers, it suggests, should enter into discussions with the Crown Estates Commissioners and with the Ministry of Justice to try and realise this policy. Yes, there would have to be room for negotiation, because if you do have whether it would be a wind farm or some other sort of project, they will need to sell their electricity, and that's mostly to the UK. So you could immediately see how discussions, negotiations might work on that. The petitioners, very wisely, I think, have felt that they shouldn't attempt to communicate with those bodies, because that begins the negotiation which the petition is asking for council ministers to take on. I know some feedback from council ministers has suggested that maybe those sort of discussions would need to go on in some sort of wider basis of the constitutional relationship between the two. So it's going to be an interesting debate on Tuesday, and it'd be interesting to see where it goes. But the motion is there; it has to be debated. We have to have a vote on it, splitting the two parts of the motion, the commitment to the policy, and the council of ministers engaging in discussion into two parts with separate votes.
And it is possible that the United Kingdom government might say, well, OK, we could potentially give you a proportion of this. Possibly this could be worth tens of millions of pounds to the Isle of Man government if the negotiations are fruitful.
Working with Keith Crush and Phil Craine, we did some research to try and identify what this might be worth, and it's actually very, very hard to say, because the idea that there would be negotiations there, what would be taken into account of that? Would it be taken into account how much the UK would pay for electricity and profits from production of which were going elsewhere? That might take something off the amount, but wind farms in the Irish Sea are currently paying in excess of 200 million a year for the options in relation to Crown estates and so on. So I don't think we get figures as high as that, but you suggested tens of millions. That doesn't sound unrealistic. These are very valuable developments.
Perhaps the difference between negotiating 10, 15, 20 years ago and now is we don't have the rather lucrative VAT deal that had kept effectively propped up the Manx government for a decade or more. So potentially we're on more firm ground in having the negotiations than we would have been when we still had that very lucrative VAT arrangement.
I think that's true. It comes back to the phrases used by Nigel about this being a just, fair and reasonable access to benefits. After all, this seabed is nearer to us than any other jurisdiction. The areas we're looking at are mostly between the Isle of Man and England on the southeastern side of the island. It seems to make very clear sense to say, out of fairness, that we should have access to at least some of these rights.
And of course, one of the things that we can't show on radio is pictures, and you've got some wonderful maps, one of which does demonstrate pretty clearly how developments in the area that we're talking about, which would be potentially an Isle of Man exclusive economic zone if we were completely independent, they do have an impact on the Isle of Man, these developments, not least in relation to the steam packet trying to tack a course through an increasing number of wind farms.
Yes, both the Morgan and the Mona wind farms to the southeast of us have, within recent months, modified their footprint in response to the requirements of other users of the Irish Sea, which presumably includes Manx steam packets. So they've made adjustments for that. In terms of their impact, one of those wind farms is a 1.5 gigawatt wind farm, so that's 1,500 megawatts. Okay, it's a very big wind farm with less than 100 turbines planned for it, not yet built. So these will be 15 megawatt turbines. So this is big, really, really big turbines. One of those wind farms is almost entirely within the area that is closest to the Isle of Man. It comes right up to our territorial sea limit, which, as I say, goes out to 22 kilometres, it comes from, or 12 nautical miles, it comes right up to that. It sort of skirts the edge of that and then extends outwards within this area that's closest to us. And that, the area that we're talking about here, the territorial sea occupies about 4,000 square kilometres, and this area that we would have these additional access to benefits is probably over 4,000 square kilometres. So it doubles the size of it. But, I stress again that territorial sea is one thing. This area will be a different arrangement, different opportunities. But nevertheless, he's a very large wind farm that would be near, almost entirely nearer to us than elsewhere. It would also bring the wind turbines we see off Douglas now, which is the Walney extension. That's an Orsted field. Some of those would be the end of that. The western end of that wind farm would be inside this area. So yeah, it does impact on us. We see this. The other wind farm I talked about, that's not yet built but under development, coming right up to the edge of the territorial sea, that will be quite a bit nearer to us, 7 kilometres or so nearer to us than the wind turbines we're seeing on the Walney extension. So these would be very visible off the eastern coast of the Isle of Man, southeast coast. This is, we clearly do have an interest in what's happening here. It's not just a passing interest.
Is this a sore or a scab worth scratching at? The constitutional relationship between the Isle of Man and the UK is unwritten. It's not entirely clear. Is it an area that we really have the appetite, do you think, to be going after? Do you think the Isle of Man government, for example, is going to try and block this when it comes to Tynwald?
On the latter, I don't think so, although maybe the second half of the motion could be open to amendment. There are different ways you could take that forward, and I think the petitioners have recognised that and are not uncomfortable with that. But is it worth scratching at this sore? I think I could understand that possibility. I could understand if government decided they didn't want to upset a constitutional relationship. But the reality is we do have financial issues, and it would be good to have more money available to government. And here we've got areas of the surrounding seabed nearer to us than anywhere else, and we're getting no benefit from that. And that, does sound like to call it an injustice that needs to be put right is stepping it up again. But if you go back to this, what is fair and just and reasonable in terms of access to these benefits, it seems utterly reasonable. It seems like something you can't expect a small independent nation simply to forego those opportunities because of the way that the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea works out, which didn't allow small nations to get a share of this. The crucial phrase in there is that you need to be a sovereign country, but sovereignty is something that has changed. It's not what it was, and we've already got this Scottish example where a country that's not sovereign has been given access to the rights of the maritime holdings. We're not looking for anything more than has been given to Scotland. So the reasonableness of this, and I would take that right back to Nigel Crowe's work, the reasonableness of this is absolutely fundamental. This is not asking for the earth, it is asking for something that is fair, just and reasonable.
How does the arrangement work with Scotland? The
Crown Estates have all of these wind farms and some oil gas developments that they have licensed. They've been going through round 5, I think, on the wind farm licensing. There have been some difficulties there because the government has been trying to charge too much for these, and they had some poorer take-up. But, all around the northern coast of Scotland, round into the North Sea, the Crown Estates makes the relationship, sets up the amount to be paid and so on. They collect that and hand it over to the Scottish Parliament in return for, as I say, currently 12%. That figure can vary, but that's what comes back in the sovereign grant.
So effectively the Scottish Government pockets 88%.
Yes, and that must be a very substantial sum. I've not seen all the figures for every one of the wind farms around there, but that must be a very substantial sum.
So looking at it on that basis, if the UK government has granted that to the Scottish government, which is less independent than the Isle of Man, it's quite a difficult argument for the UK government to turn around to the Isle of Man and say, actually, no, we can't do that. Except, of course, that the Scottish situation was much more to do with internal UK politics than it was to do with fairness.
And it's interesting to see that the change was made in 2014, negotiated through 2013, made in 2014, which was the year of the Scottish referendum, of course. So to what extent there was pressure felt that if you said there, if Scotland was independent, they would have had the rights to the seabed, okay? And the Isle of Man would be in that position, but I don't want to mix that up. This petition, the motion to Tynwald, is not about changing the relationship between the Isle of Man and the UK. We would remain a Crown dependency. We would take on no additional rights other than we would have access to the benefits of the maritime holdings, which is really clear. It is, as I say, the genius of it is this is the gentlest way I can imagine of attempting to begin a discussion about whether or not the Isle of Man should get access to some of these benefits. So
2 predictions I'm looking for from you then. First one is, how do you think you're going to get on in the December Tynwald? Are you going to succeed? And the second prediction is, if you do succeed, how likely do you think the prospect is of this being successful?
Okay, I think the first of those is much more likely than the second. I think the petitioners at times have talked about this being a David and Golliath situation. That it could be hard. On the first, will we get it through Tynwald on Tuesday? I think I would say there's a good chance. I've heard some people with some reservations. There are some people who are keeping their cards close to their chest, but others have said, why wouldn't we do this? We're only looking to begin talking about it. It's no declaration of anything. It's just begin talking. So I think there's a chance. I think there's a reasonable chance of getting the first part of it through. The second part, how we go about it, is it council ministers that begin having discussions and what form they should take. That may be different, and I think that's crucial that that's thought through, considered. I don't know the full extent of current discussions that take place either with the Crown Estate Commissioners or the Ministry of Justice. So it'd be happy to take a lead from others on that, in a sense. Is it likely to be successful? I go back to what was suggested by officers from the external relations. They thought it would be slim, and it's back to this issue of do we have a record of the United Kingdom doing the morally right thing, even if their own interests are not served by that. Nothing too conspicuous in that direction, I think, is a fair way of putting it.
That was Paul Craine MLC. His motion goes to Tynwald this week and would appear to have a fair chance of success. Is there any point in asking the UK government to give us the money? It might be fair and equitable for them to do so, and they set a precedent with Scotland, but they're also strapped for cash and need every penny they've got. Do we risk provoking our large neighbour into considering other aspects of our constitutional relationship? Or do you think this is a welcome first step in gaining the control our nation rightly deserves? Don't forget, this programme is available as a podcast on Manx Radio's website. For now, though, I'm Phil Gaughan. Goramayu. Thanks for listening.